Hey y'all, Moses here. Today I'm going to be covering 5 tips to improve your squad play. Squads can be difficult as a game mode. Dealing with up to 4 enemies requires snap decision making, clear communication, and at times pinpoint execution, all while managing other in-game variables like the circle, looting, and positioning. The underlying key factor in this video is going to be synergy, or in more simpler terms, discovering how each person in the squad adds to the overall effectiveness of the team. As with any of these videos, my playstyle and some of the examples I give might not match up with how you and your friends play the game, and some of the ideas presented here cannot always be translated into game-to-game viability. So, with that said, let's get started. 1. Drop strategy and time management. Drop strategy and time management in the early game is imperative to overall squad success in the mid and late game. A successful early game is effectively gearing your squad quickly, which often means landing in a dense looting zone such as a town, the military base, or in another area of the map where small groups of houses are relatively close together. My personal favorite is North Georgie, but depending on the path of the plane, you may choose to go elsewhere. The issue with dense looting zones is the fact that many enemy squads will likely have the same idea and will drop there with you. To counteract this, you have 2 options. The first is to plan a long float away from the plane trajectory to a loot zone that is out of the way. And the second is to drop into a high vehicle spawn location and drive to a looting zone, again out of the way of the plane path. Having time and space to loot greatly increases your chances of survival later, as having an undergeared squad will make teamfights more difficult to win. If you prefer to drop into a dense loot zone with other players, it is important to loot within a short distance of each other, as the more distance you put between you and your squad, the harder it is to support a teammate who gets themselves into a fight. Try to stay within 100 meters of each other, and be sure to call your movements when entering or leaving a house, and communicate that you are close to another squad member to avoid false callouts for enemies nearby. Like early game and solo, I recommend taking a few early fights if possible when you get lucky with loot within the first 5 minutes. Exploiting your good fortune and pressuring a potentially undergeared squad into a fight will rapidly increase your looting speed and propel you into the mid-game faster. Regardless of which strategy you employ, time management is a constant factor throughout all stages of the game. Due to the nature of the loot RNG, your squad may require extra time to loot. If you employ a long drop strategy, you may find yourself outside the zone with a considerable distance to travel. Always take note of vehicle spawn locations as you parachute into your drop zone, and get familiar with the garage locations inside of the main towns. If you get loot tunnel vision and find yourself racing the circle on foot, you will be putting pressure on your medical supplies when you likely have few to begin with. Having a designated person to call out circle spawn, travel distance, and vehicle locations is an effective way to stay organized and have a plan once you either finish looting or have to leave to get to the safe zone. This brings me to my second tip. 2. Designating roles and understanding your team. Squad effectiveness is determined by the strengths and weaknesses of the individuals that comprise the team. Some players may be more vocal, whereas others prefer to be quiet and go with the flow. You may prefer sniping while your buddies prefer more traditional loadouts. In my opinion, there are 3 key roles that every successful squad needs to fill: the leader, the shooters, and the support. The leader should be your most vocal member and is responsible for overall decision-making of the squad. Having a decisive voice will keep your team moving in the right direction and taking the right fights. Being a leader doesn't mean being a super tactical strategy master. It just means that the leader needs to be keeping the team moving, paying attention to the zones and circle time and the overall health of the squad, and if possible, have the confidence to recognize when to fight and when to evade. I could dedicate a whole video to being a good leader, but for now, I'll give you some quick points. The leader needs to call out circle timers, distance to the zone, and poll the team frequently for information about meds, ammo, and gear. The leader needs to keep the team positive and provide productive feedback, even in failure. The leader should probably drive the vehicle if you have one. And finally, the leader needs to be able to put squad success over individual success. That last point is probably the most important. Doing all of those things probably means you won't be able to have as much fun sniping at enemies because you're herding your cats back into the vehicle or into a better position so you don't get wiped. It's a tough role to fill, but it's a requirement. The shooters are your primary combat players. Before I continue, everyone is technically a combat player and everyone should be engaged in a team fight, but the shooter should be your skill players. Your two primary shooters should have extra ammunition to distribute to each other and to the team. Shooters should also have the ability to execute flanks properly and be effective at medium and long range engagements. Communication and decision making is just as important with this role as it is with the leader. Calling out both personal and enemy movements during a fight is also key. In fact, your shooter should ideally be the ones directing an engagement while the leader manages the squad callouts. Simply put, shooters need to be able to take on the primary offensive role in the team. The support player is critical to team success. Just because I'm calling this role support doesn't mean that this player doesn't engage in team fights and doesn't communicate. The support player should be your designated reviver and should always position themselves to be able to get to the rest of the team quickly to either revive or to prevent a downed teammate from getting eliminated by a pushing enemy. The support player is the only role where I suggest a specific piece of gear and a specific weapon. The support player should have the largest pack to carry extra meds to be distributed if others run out. This means likely having to sacrifice space normally reserved for primary and secondary ammunition. I would also recommend the support players carry an S12K to deal with enemy players pressing you during a revive or in a close quarters situation. Speaking of medical supplies, every player on the team should follow the rule of 2. 2 first aid, 2 boost, 2 bandages. 2 bandages might not seem like a lot, but recognize that bandages take up a tremendous amount of bag space and should only be used to top yourself up or to heal in emergencies until you can use a first aid. This means that the support player should ideally have enough medical supplies to distribute at least 1 first aid and 1 boost to every player in the team should they run out. That means constantly collecting meds from downed enemies to ensure that you have enough. I'd also recommend the support player carry a gas can in the early game to be able to fuel up a vehicle that might not be filled. These roles are not strict, and you should rotate the roles to see what works best for the personalities in your team. Now that we're talking about gear, let's move on to the third point. 3. Gear equality among teammates. Group strength equates to group success. In this case, I'm talking about gear strength. It's important during the loot phase to call out extra gear that you come across and can't carry, such as helmets, backpacks, and armor. I'd like to think that most teams do this already. However, after a successful team fight, it is important to do a gear check after looting the dead enemies. Essentially what I'm saying is, don't be selfish. If you have a completely kitted AR with a silencer, you probably don't need to be carrying a compensator on your secondary AR. Pull your team to see what attachments are in use and see if another player could benefit from that. Similarly, if you have a Kar 98 and your mate has an SKS, they will benefit far more from that cheek pad than you will. If your team is at its most effective when everyone has a fully kitted primary, you will have the luxury of the loot snowball as you continue to eliminate enemy teams and take their gear. The leader should poll the team for gear needs at regular intervals to make sure the squad remains effective. 4. Clear, concise communication. This point will likely have its own video at some point, but I'm going to touch on some of the basics. The keys to good comms are precision and clarity. The most frustrating aspect of communications is when you have a teammate call out an enemy at a tree or in the house in the window, or frantic callouts when they get downed. The first thing you need to get comfortable with is the compass at the top of the screen, which gives directions in degrees of 5 and the cardinal directions. You must recognize that any callout is relevant to your position and might not be as precise to your teammates who may be at a different spot than you. So, what makes a good callout? The answer is detail in as few words as possible. Let's break it down. This next part is pretty hard to script, so I'm just going to kind of improv here, but a bad callout would be guys in the field running by the house down the hill in front of us. That callout tells us that there are an undetermined amount of enemies in a field running by a house and they're downhill. In some instances, that might be the perfect amount of information. However, if you're in the hills around Pachinki or another major town, that callout might be useless. A better callout would be something like enemies north 15 degrees, 3 players moving left to right in the wheat field by the blue triple story. Within the first 5 words of that callout, you're orienting your team to look in the proper direction, and as the callout continues, you get more precise. So breaking down the better callout into my personal formula is objective, cardinal direction, degrees, concise detail. The quicker you can get this information to your team, the better, but accuracy is far more useful to the squad than panicked callouts. Like any other skill, communication takes time to develop. 5. Choosing to fight at the right time and reacting effectively to attacks. The easiest way to wipe your squad is to drag them into a fight when they are unprepared or when you're at a disadvantage. The effectiveness and success rate of a squad is determined specifically by their ability to dispatch an enemy team as quickly as possible while suffering as little damage as possible. There are a few rules I follow and encourage when I play squads. 1. Don't shoot without communicating first. 2. Assume the enemy is at full strength. And 3. Recognize and communicate advantages and disadvantages. The first point is the most important. Unless you are immediately confronted by an enemy that absolutely requires a reaction, you should make a good call out so that your team can support you. The revive system indicates that unless you have godly aim or a golden opportunity to wipe a squad, that you will likely not be able to take out 4 players on your own before any return fire comes your way. Communicating before you engage will allow your team to do as much damage during the first part of the engagement and will make it harder for the enemy to evade if you can get into a good position before firing. Assuming the enemy is at full strength does not mean that downing and then killing a player means the fight is over. Don't feel safe looting or holding your position because the dead player has likely relayed that information to his team who may be nearby. After downing a player or completing a kill, I often change positions to see if anyone else shows up. A common behavior is when a player is killed on an enemy team, the other players feel the need to quickly avenge or protect that player if they are downed. With that said, immediately killing a downed player might not always be the best option. Sniping a single player and baiting him to discover the rest of his team is an effective strategy. With that in mind, don't chase kills on a downed player if that means putting yourself or your team at risk. Recognizing and communicating advantages or disadvantages is key in a fight. If you've downed 2 players out of 4 and they retreat into a building, surrounding that building would give you an advantage. Another example would be enemies taking cover around or behind a vehicle. Blowing up the vehicle may net you an easy kill, and if the whole squad knows to shoot the vehicle, it can happen in seconds. Disadvantages are also important to communicate. The leader will sometimes have to decide to go for a revive or abandon a downed teammate during a late game circle change. Frequently, other squads will be drawn to a gunfight or the sound of gunfire looking to clean up a weakened squad. Calling out when to retreat or reposition can be more important than finishing a downed enemy or grabbing extra loot. I hope what I covered here was in some way useful to you. All of the footage shown today was taken from my Twitch sub games, which occur every weekend over on twitch.tv/wtfmoses. I'd like to thank them for their support and for allowing me to figure out my own style, as I was an exclusively solo player until recently. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more content like this in the future. Of course, if you have any feedback or comments, head down to the comments section and leave me a note. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, I'll see you out there.